What if the class you think is pointless or the job that feels like a dead end are actually building the key relationships that will carry you to and through your career? Today, you'll meet a PA who was rejected from PA school for 20 years. He worked anti-terrorism, epidemiology, EMS, military medicine, and now finally, after becoming a PA, he says success isn't about credentials. It's about who's in your foxhole. I know what you've been told to focus on: GPA, hours, applications, and I also know what no one is teaching you. So today, we're going to talk about what actually sustains a career in medicine and what happens if you wait too long to build it. Welcome to Shadow Me Next, a podcast where I take you into and behind the scenes of the medical world to provide you with a deeper understanding of the human side of medicine. I'm Ashley, a physician assistant, medical editor, clinical preceptor, and the creator of Shadow Me Next. I invite you to join me as we take a conversational and personal look into the lives and minds of leaders in medicine. This is Shadow Me Next with Johnnie Gilpen. Thank you so much for joining us today on Shadow Me Next. I am very excited to talk about some of these things that you have seen and learned in your over 30 years of work in medicine.
Well, thank you for having me here. Glad to be here.
Absolutely incredible. So, Johnnie, take us back 30 years. You are, you're a young kid. You think medicine is for you. Did you know, were you for sure that this was the road you were going to take, or did it kind of take some twists and turns?
I absolutely had no idea. None. I grew up farming in Oklahoma, maybe veterinarian medicine, but never medicine. I joined the Oklahoma National Guard. I was flying on Huey helicopter crew chief, and I got the opportunity to fly as a crew chief on a medevac, and that exposed me to medicine.
Mm.
And that's how I got exposed to medicine. I never had dreamed. It was never in my mindset I was going to be an ag teacher. My family was teachers. And so we went, I went active duty Navy as a Navy corpsman. And that's how I got my start in medicine.
Which is interesting because if you know anything about the history of being a PA, which is what you are now, PAs came from the Navy. That's kind of where we originated. So it's really enjoyable to hear that our Navy corpsmen are still pursuing that course. Tell us a little bit about schooling. Were you schooled in the military? Were you schooled as a civilian? How did that work?
So no, I didn't go back to PA school till I was 46.
Nice.
Yeah, I went back as an older, but it wasn't because of due to lack of trying. I got hurt when I was in the military and medically retired. And so I went back to school and I applied for PA school, and they told me I needed to go back. My grades weren't good enough from my grades prior to the military. And so they told me to get a graduate degree. And so I got a degree in biostatistics and epidemiology.
Mm.
And I applied and I got turned down three times. It took me 4 times over 20 years to get applied.
This is a great time to pause for a segment on the show called Quality Questions, where we talk about an interview question that you might hear on your own pre-health interview. So as you know, Johnnie applied and applied and applied and eventually got into PA school, but he had to do his fair share of waiting and his fair share of working hard towards his goal. An interview question that we could create based on the situation would be something like this. Tell me about a time when you were told no or felt like you didn't belong, but chose to keep going anyway. This is a great opportunity on interview for you to explain a very challenging situation and the steps that you took to overcome it. And it doesn't just stop at quality questions. There are more resources for you as a pre-health student on shadowmenext.com to include our newly released application readiness course. So head on over to courses.shadowmenext.com and check it out.
But I did a bioterrorism and emerging infectious disease fellowship with the NIH. So in the meantime, I was working with Homeland Security, doing interesting things. I worked for the State Department's anti-terrorism assistance team, working as an epidemiologist, and and I was still working as a medic. And so I kept applying, and finally, I wanted to be there. I was told that I was a veteran and I would never get into PA school, by a PA director, which is kind of ironic, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
The whole PA program was tied back to the first three PAs were Navy corpsmen. He told me, I said, well, what about all my experience? He said, I could get people to have your kind of experience. I couldn't get you to pass a test. It's kind of ironic. It kind of came back around. I am now on the board of directors for the Oklahoma Academy of PAs, and I got to see that person this year. He turned around, he looked at me, and he just turned around and walked away. Wouldn't even talk to me.
Unbelievable.
So that was my process. So I didn't go back to school till later in life. So there was, but I think I took anatomy 4 times, because anatomy is one of those classes that had to be every 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I have multiple degrees. I have a degree in EMS. I have a degree in microbiology with minors in chemistry and medical entomology, biostatistics and epidemiology, and then PA.
And you know what I think is so interesting is that I'm sure you don't quote unquote, use your microbiology or your medical entomology degree every day, right? But these things, this education that you have really cultivated over the last number of years, it definitely informs the rest of your practice, I would imagine. And perhaps stuff like epidemiology, working in the pediatric emergency room right now, that's going to play a bigger role, right? But do you ever, looking back on it, I guess speaking very honestly, do you ever feel like any of it was a waste of time or perhaps a misstep or a misdirection? Or is it all truly collaborative to who you are and what you're doing right now?
Absolutely. Looking back, none of it is. Somebody asked me when I was in PA school, I was the oldest person in the College of Medicine. They said, they did an interview and they said, if you could give us one piece of advice, what would you give somebody? And I said, well, if you're offered a class, I don't care what class it is. I mean, it could be underwater basket weaving. Take a class. 10 years from now, you may not know what that class is. You won't remember it. But if you're in a class, I always say, go to lunch with the people in the class, or if it's a couple-day class, go to dinner with that people. It's the people, the relationships that you build, because what I have found is that those relationships are what build, of course you get education and the pieces that I've learned. Of course, we're tick-borne diseases, understanding about, everybody thinks they have, um, some form of tick-borne disease, whether it's Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or, whatever, tularemia. And I'm like, no, you don't have this or that, understanding the epidemiology of certain things, the relationships I cultivated in the military. Now I'm working a program. Hopefully we'll be doing our Art of Medicine program where we're teaching this class to all the medics at Disney. The guy who I'm working with is somebody I worked with 30 years ago in the Navy. So those relationships, I mean, every job, like the job I have now, is somebody I met as a medic 15, 20 years ago. And then he called me during the pandemic, said, hey, right after the pandemic was over, said, hey, what do you make over there at the adult side? And I told him. He said, well, you interested in coming over to the ped side? So all of those relationships, it looks like this scatterboard. If you put everything I did, this huge multiple page resume that I have, and you would think it's like a scatterboard, but it's bumper cars, right? But it all plays together.
I love that. I mean, you're describing networking, which I think we've turned into such a challenging word sometimes, networking, and it feels very pressured, sometimes, and very stressful for some people. But I love the way you described it, which is relationship building and community driving. And that's important. And I think if you're listening and you feel like you're in kind of like a dead end position, or you're in a place where you really don't see how it's going to affect what you want to do ultimately in the future, I think this is a great story to listen to because, I'm sure you had moments where you're like, well, what am I doing here? Why am I here? This is not going to affect or play a role in anything I want to do. And yet looking back on it 20, 30 years later, it just all of a sudden it makes sense and you can kind of pull back and see the bigger picture. So hang in there. That's for sure. You mentioned something and I don't want to glaze over it because I do think it's quite interesting. When you were discussing working as an epidemiologist and anti-terrorism, I think a lot of us nowadays would know what that means. Anti-terrorism, initially we think about more obvious, dramatic destruction. However, what does epidemiology, what role does that play in terrorism these days?
So I got my role. I wrote my specialty is foreign animal diseases as in ag terrorism. Like go back to October of 2001, you had the anthrax outbreak. Everybody kind of remembers about that. So when we talk about it in human aspects, we talk about how many people it kills. When we talk about it in agricultural aspects, we talk about the economic impact. So the foot and mouth disease, not hand, foot, and mouth, what we talk about in kids, but foot and mouth disease in cattle and pigs. If it's not in the United States right now, but if it was to get into the United States, we would not be able to export any cloven hoofed animals for at least 1 year. You would have to kill every single animal that was cloven, pig, sheep, within a certain radius, and you go out in a radius. So where this was at, and you're talking about economic impact. So when we talk about these diseases in agriculture, you talk about it in economic impact. And so it's a huge aspect. It's a huge, foreign animal diseases have a different multiplier. When certain diseases come in, where they have problems, it's considered a terrorist event until proven otherwise because of the economic impact. Matter of fact, they have more resources thrown at them than you would have like some other stuff, because most human stuff we can give and we can collapse it. We don't have that capability with animal diseases. And so they're worried about the economic impact of it. So yeah, it was an interesting special.
Gosh, I could imagine. I'm so glad that you made it to being a PA because all these things that you have done in the past just seem so incredibly interesting. I'm thinking to myself, how on earth did you ever leave that? I mean, even working as an EMS, I'm sure you have incredible stories as a first responder. Well, like working in the ER, some days it's not all TV. Some days the kids are coming in with a toenail half off, which is interesting to me. I work in derm, that. Like sniffles, and then other days the true emergencies. Working in EMS is the same. Before we get to that, though, really talking about a day in your life. And maybe we can talk a little bit about both, working as a first responder and also now as a pediatric emergency medicine PA. Let's take a step back real quick and mention you've created programs that we've talked about it a little bit, like the art of medicine and the art of struggle. Tell me what you've learned about resilience.
Yeah. So 3 years, it'll be 3 years ago next month, we lost 6 kids in about 3 weeks.
Oh,
that's one thing about, it's like when Marines go down range, sometimes Marines don't come home. Sometimes kids come in the ER. We lost one yesterday. It just happens. And one day we had a kid that it was a bad deal. And one of my attendings, you're playing this back and forth in your head. Could you have done something better, worse, different? And 30 years in medicine, I've realized that sometimes no matter, you could be the best trauma surgeon, the best whatever, and there's a higher role power, that there was something, the cards were already laid out. There was nothing you could do to change the outcome of that. Mm-hmm. That's what I believe. And I was talking with my attending he had a son that was the same age as this kid. And at that time, I said, Doc, we did it right. You did it right. He's like, well, I said, and I made that same comment to him about, there's nothing we could do. And he said, um, how do you do it? And I said, do what? And he said, this. And I said, he said, like, you've been doing this is my 28th year at that time.
Mm.
He said, you've been doing it like 20 something years. I said, yeah. And he said, how do you still do it? And I said, well, I don't do it real well. I asked my wife. I deflected, I'm an absolute mess, which I am. And my wife is an amazing woman, and she puts up with me and doesn't strangle me in my sleep. She's, and so, but he looked at me and he said, you're still here. And that comment really bothered me. And so I thought on it a couple of weeks. I went back to him and I said, so his comment was, his inference was, is why am I not a statistic? I'm a veteran, first responder. I'm still a paramedic, still on the disaster response team. I told him, I said, I'm not any stronger than those people who have taken their lives. I'm probably less, but I said, there's a couple things. One, my faith, I'm a very bad Baptist and a very poor Methodist. I grew up Methodist. My wife has me going to a Baptist church, so I'm not very good. But my faith in God gets me through most days.
Mm-hmm.
I have a Rolodex of friends, which is what I told him. But I said, it's truly, I have a Rolodex of brothers and sisters. And most people these days don't know what a Rolodex is, but I have hundreds of friends that I can call that I've worked with, these relationships, this community that I have built, that I know that somebody's going to pick up the phone and they're going to be there to help me walk through this and carry me through this. And it's a reciprocal relationship. And then third is that when I lost 4 days before my 25th birthday, I lost 14 of good friends. And so when I was on active duty, and when I got back home, my dad was a Vietnam vet who had Agent Orange cancer, and he took me to a meeting with him, and he told me, he said, don't wait 30 years to discuss these things. Like, don't be like I do us, don't just keep it all bundled up. And so I've lived by that word, and I've learned these tools. So I've taken and really worked on these tools. And so he asked me to build him a class that he could teach them. And so if you can see that, there's the book. And so it ended up being 2 books when it split up. It went from a 2-hour class to an 8-hour class. And anyway, the program is it's not just based, it's mine, but it was originally based off of Eric Weimeyer, is the first blind guy to ever climb Mount Everest. And Jeff Evans, I don't know if you know who Jeff is. He's an emergency medicine PA. He is a good friend. They're both good friends. Jeff was the guide who took Eric to the top. And so they have a program called No Barriers. And it's about getting people who have both physical and invisible wounds into the mountains, into nature. And they had started this program, and it's based off of Eric's comments and thoughts. And so they have a program for their warriors. And I said, I was climbing with Eric, and I said, Eric, I said, can I take your program that you've done and that you've done for veterans, and I want to take it to healthcare and take my twist on it? And he said, sure, do whatever you want to. So I taken Eric's comment for 7 things, his vision, rope teams things, his baseline, and I took it and expanded on it. And so that's where we're at today. But the difference between our program and most programs, I don't stand up and lecture to you. The program is all about action. You're doing, it's a book. We put away all computers, all phones. You're actually handwriting. We're activating the reticular activation system. It's a different thing. We're talking about what I found is most people, whether you're a physician or PA, you've been focused so much on getting there that you don't necessarily develop those relationships. But we identify who's in your foxhole. And in the military, we talk about your foxhole. That's your fighting position in life. And it's usually a 3-man foxhole is the best kind of foxhole to have, because one person could be on watch, one person can be resting, and the other person, can be doing maintenance. But and it goes back to King Solomon. King Solomon let's see if I can find it here. King Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, a person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but two can stand back to back, and three are even better, for a triple braided cord is not easily broken.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you take an army manual or the Bible or whatever. So who are the two closest people to you, and who are the people you're going to call?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we help them identify like two people that are in your foxhole, and not people who are going to just placate you, but who are going to call you out, who are going to be there. And then the other aspect is you have to be willing to do the same thing for them.
Mm.
So we give them tools, and that's the key thing, is about making sure whatever program it is not about just going through the computer, not about just doing it. Resiliency is about, it's a it's a it's about doing it over and over and over again. Resiliency is that rocky moments in our life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
It's perfect. It's perfect. And I'm glad that you said it's about doing it over and over and over again, because I don't think anybody gets to the other side of these challenges and goes, woof, there we go. Check the box. I've developed resiliency. It's something that you just see and see again. And eventually you realize, okay, like this is forming that tool. This is forming that strength. And the relational aspect of this, the fact that you encourage people to form these relationships, of coming from somebody who has been in situations where it would be very difficult to speak about some of the things that you've seen and done with other people. And the fact that you have these friendships, these relationships where they know if you're calling, it probably means it's going to be something tough. That's life-changing. If you're interested in learning more about the art of medicine or any of the other incredible resources that Johnnie has to offer, they're available at johnnygilpen.com. That's JOHNNIEGILPEN.com. Johnnie, you're amazing. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for sharing it with all of us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you so very much for listening to this episode of Shadow Me Next. If you liked this episode, or if you think it could be useful for a friend, please subscribe and invite them to join us next Monday. As always, if you have any questions, let me know on Facebook or Instagram. Access you want, stories you need. You're always invited to Shadow Me Next. Please keep in mind that the content of this podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only, and should not be considered as professional medical advice. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company.